welcome to episode 2 of Ancient History Bites with Eric. I'm your host, Eric, and today we're going to continue our discussion of ancient Egyptian religion with a focus on religious festivals and pilgrimages today. And this is a really exciting topic because these were the few times of year when ordinary, run-of-the-mill, typical ancient Egyptians like us were able to really see and visualize and interact and praise their gods. So the ancient Egyptians loved these times of year. And not only were they a festival for piety, they were also a time for celebration and feasting and all that kind of stuff. So they were also very fun. So this was a really high point in most Egyptians' years, I do think. And they were a great way to break up sort of the monotony and mundaneness of a typical, agricultural work. So they were really fun times, and we're going to explore them pretty in depth today. Before we move into that, I'll start today with another myth, like I did last time. I think this is kind of a good way to approach the myths, just little by little. Each time we'll do, one myth. And so the myth that we're going to talk about today is pretty foundational for Egyptian religion and religious thought. And this is the myth of Seth and Osiris. So it's a tale of brotherly rivalry, and there's murder, there's death, there's gory coffin stuff, all that kind of neat stuff that we love in the Egyptian myths. And so the two protagonists are Osiris and Seth, who we actually met in last week's episode. So we know that they're the children of Geb and Nut. So they're brothers, Seth and Osiris. They're each married to one of their sisters. So Osiris is married to Isis and Seth is married to Nephthys. And here's just a little image or diagram of all this going on. So the parents are on the top, and then Osiris and his brothers and sisters are on the bottom. Osiris is on the far left, and then you'll see Seth as sort of the jackal-headed looking one. So Seth is kind of a weird-looking god. We're not even sure what that animal is exactly, but it's meant to be kind of weird. So Seth is the god of chaos. And so you're going to be able to tell that he is probably the antagonist in this story, and you're right. So yeah, very important myth, and you'll find that Isis is the real heroine of the story. She's a truly devoted wife, and really the mother of all Egyptians and their protector. So the myth goes a little something like this. So long ago, back in those good old days, long before humans had come and messed up the world with all their din and racket and annoyance, Osiris ruled the gods as king. And he was a good king. People loved him. He preserved order. And that's what the Egyptians and the Egyptian gods loved. So unsurprisingly, given Seth's temperament and his kind of chaotic nature, he was not happy with this state of affairs. He was a little bit jealous. And I'd actually even venture to say he was blind with jealousy. He was really pissed off that Osiris got this role as king just because he was the firstborn. After all, Seth was more powerful than Osiris, he thought, and more cunning, too. And not only this, Seth didn't have that same undying need for order and justice that his brother Osiris just kind of boringly clung to. He didn't have that need. He didn't really have any problem shaking up what was considered to be the natural order of things, of disturbing Ma'at, as you might say. And so Seth devised a relatively diabolical plan. He organized a huge festival, a really fun event, inviting all the other gods and putting out a really great spread, lots of music, lots of dance. So it was really a good time and everybody wanted to come, and they did. So all the gods were there. And during the festivities, while they were happening, Seth organized a little friendly competition. Maybe a little bit morbid, but friendly, supposedly. So the competition was, he had built a beautiful coffin, inlaid with gold and silver and lapis lazuli and all these other precious stones. A really gorgeous coffin, and anyone would want to be buried in this. And the Egyptians were pretty obsessed with death, so they were really, really into this coffin. And so the competition was whoever fit in this coffin the best would win the coffin as a prize. What a great prize, and what an easy competition. So Osiris was like, oh, I love this coffin. It's a great coffin. I want to win it. And he was never one to back down from a competition anyway. So he stepped right up to partake. Okay, so we got to pause here and I got to complain because what is Osiris thinking? He's clearly not the sharpest crane in the box. I mean, his pretty shifty, slimy brother, Seth, who looks like a weird jackal creature, has asks him to just step in a coffin. There's a bunch of lead nearby that looks like it could be used to seal the thing. And Osiris is just like, okay, let me get right in. My guy, come on, let's think about this a little bit. But anyway, I won't judge. The Egyptians really did have coffin envy, and he got coffin crazy. They loved their coffins, and so maybe he just saw this coffin and was like, all right, I can't resist. But anyway, not the smartest thing. But lo and behold, beyond all reason, Osiris gets in the coffin, and shocker of shockers, Seth immediately puts the lid on, seals it with lead, throws it in the river, and Osiris washes away, presumably never to be seen again. I don't know who could have predicted this. So no more Osiris, right? Seth wins, Osiris is dead and gone. Well, not so fast. In comes Isis, the ever dutiful Isis. So of course she was horrified at what had occurred. Her husband had been murdered by his own brother. She was miserable and horrified. And she decided to go out in search of her dead husband because she knew that Osiris could not resurrect, could not enjoy the afterlife if he wasn't on Egyptian soil. And so she went out in search of her deceased lover. She looked far and wide. She looked everywhere, under every stone, every rock, in the marshes of the Nile, up in the deserts, in the cataracts, everywhere she could look. But she couldn't find him. But eventually, she set her sights even beyond Egypt. And it turned out that Osiris had washed all the way down the Nile to the sea. The sea currents had drifted him away, and he'd landed in Byblos, near modern-day Lebanon. So he'd drifted really, really far. But Isis dutifully makes her way all the way there. She finds him. She finds his coffin. She rejoices. She lugs that thing back to Egypt and then hides it in the marshes of the Nile, hoping that Seth won't find it there. And she leaves it there for a bit because she's got other things to do. Presumably, she has to learn some spells because she is the mistress of magic, the goddess of magic. And she's got to learn some spells to revive her dead husband. So anyway, so she's gone, she leaves it there. Crafty old Seth, of course, he finds the coffin in these marshes. And not content to just, send him out to sea again, Seth cuts Osiris into at least 14 pieces and scatters them all over Egypt. He scatters the dismembered body of his brother all over Egypt. Legend has it that Osiris's most important part, his head, is buried in Abydos, the city of Abydos, kind of near Thebes, in middle upper Egypt. And thereafter, and forevermore, Abydos became a major cult center for Osiris, and we'll actually talk about it later. So anyway, so Osiris's body is scattered all over Egypt. But Isis never wanted to give up. She is such a good, determined wife. She finds every single piece with the help of her sister Nephthys, who thinks her brother Seth has gone a little too far this time. So Isis and Nephthys look all over Egypt again, finding Osiris's body parts, and they manage to find all but one. And Isis dutifully puts Osiris back together like a little puzzle so that her husband is whole and complete again and can resurrect. So you might be wondering what that missing piece was. Well, sad to say, Osiris had lost his wiener. Yep, his penis was gone. A fish, apparently, had eaten it while it was in the Nile, and there was no getting that back. It's already been digested. It's already fish poop, so no more penis. But Isis was crafty and clever, and she was a witch. She was a magician. So she just fashioned a new one. She made one out of wood or gold or whatever it may be, and she just stuck it on there. And, once he was all back together, she said her spell, she did her godly magic, and resurrected her husband Osiris. Hooray! So he's all put together. And the first thing they do, basically, is put that penis to good use. So Osiris, upon resurrecting, immediately impregnates Isis with a son. And then, unfortunately, he can't stay in the realm, in the upper realms. He has to descend into the netherworld and become god of the dead. And forevermore, that is his place. He's king of the dead, god of the underworld. But that's okay. He's happy with that. He's a god of regeneration of the underworld. So who's going to be the god of the upper world, the king of Egypt? Well, of course, Seth wants to be that. But shortly after being impregnated by Osiris, Isis gives birth to her son, Horus, the falcon god. And I won't get into all the details, but Horus and Seth wage a pitched war, a pitched battle for many years to determine who's going to be king of Egypt. And eventually, Horus wins, he defeats Seth, and he becomes king of Egypt, and he banishes Seth to the desert. So Seth becomes lord of the desert, lord of chaos, all these scary things that the Egyptians don't like. That's Seth's domain. And Horus is king of Egypt. And with this, he ensures proper royal succession in Egypt. Osiris was the king of Egypt. He died and passed it on to his son Horus, who is now the king of Egypt. And this is where that story ends. And so we learn several really important things about Egyptian mythology, thought, and religion from this myth. The first is the belief in the resurrection of the body after death. So this story is a very hopeful story for Egyptians because Osiris died and was resurrected because he was buried in Egypt. And so Egyptians think that they can do this too. Originally, in older times, it was just supposedly the king who could do this, who could die and be reborn and then become one with Osiris. But eventually, around the New Kingdom and later, everyday, ordinary Egyptians can do this too. As long as you have enough money to prepare your body and prepare the funeral correctly, you too can become one with Osiris in death and resurrect. So it gives the Egyptians hope for an afterlife. So that's one important thing. Another important thing that we discover is the importance of being buried in Egypt and whole. So Osiris really couldn't resurrect because he was in a foreign land. The Egyptians loved their land, they were super patriotic and nationalistic, and they needed to be buried in Egypt in order to be reborn. It was very important for them. And so we see this in the myth as well. And then not only that, but you also have to be whole and complete of body. Osiris couldn't quite resurrect without his 14th body part, his penis. And so he really needed that to resurrect. And I think this comes from the idea because your physical body is what you use in the afterlife. That's why mummification was so important for the Egyptians. You had to keep the body as intact as possible because that's what you were going to use when you woke up at night to go walk the land of the living. And so you've got to be intact. And we even find evidence of people who were amputees who didn't have certain appendages. They actually got ones made out of, whatever it be, wood or stone or something, and then buried with so that they could use those in the afterlife. So being buried whole, complete in Egypt was very important. So we learned that from the myth. And then the last thing is it sets up this idea of the succession of kingship, as I mentioned just earlier. So Osiris, king of the gods, he dies and is reborn, but then he passes along kingship to his son Horus, and then Horus dies and becomes Osiris, etc., etc., and the cycle continues. And the king, who is, the earthly image of Horus in the same way, once he dies, he becomes one with Osiris, and then his son becomes Horus, the king of Egypt. And so that's also set up in this myth. So we learn a lot from this myth, and it's really interesting. And this myth is actually reenacted every year in a festival that we'll talk about a little bit later. But first, we'll just give some background and some general ideas about what these festivals were like. Okay, so the ancient Egyptians celebrated a ton of festivals throughout the year. On average, there was at least one per month, if not more. And since they had 12 months in the calendar, that's at least 12 festivals every year. So they were pretty busy partying for a good portion of the year, actually. Some festivals were bigger, some were smaller. It depended on the season and what the festival was about. But the ancient Egyptians front-loaded their festivals at the beginning of the year. Their year started around mid-August in our calendar. And this was the period of the inundation. So this is when the Nile would start to flood its banks. And then there'd be standing water, or like quite a large quantity of water in all the fields. And so there was a lull in agricultural labor as they were waiting for the fields to drain. And so it made sense to do a lot of the festivals while you really couldn't do any agricultural work. So that's why they concentrated all their partying sort of at the beginning, not all of it, but a lot of their partying at the beginning of the year. So this is when they had their New Year's festival. They had the Opet festival, which is a big celebration of the pharaoh in Thebes. And then they had the Mysteries of Osiris, which I'll talk about a little bit later. So a lot of festivals at the beginning portion of the year. So it was a really big time to party, sort of like we have New Year's, which is a big festival for us. There's no way we can talk about all the ancient Egyptian religious festivals because there's too many. So first we'll just discuss some generalities about what typically happens at these religious festivals and feasts and that kind of thing. And then I'll just give two specific examples of my favorite festivals, and we'll talk a little bit about what goes on at those particular festivals. So in general, the ancient Egyptian religious festivals had three major components. The first was, and the most important, was the religious component, which makes sense because they were religious festivals. And so for this component, basically what would happen is they would take the god's shrine out of its temple, put it in a sacred boat, and then they would sort of parade it around the city for the whole world to see. And so the boats looked a little something like this. So they were pretty lavish affairs. And it's interesting to note that even though this was a time for, people to quote unquote see the god, they actually couldn't physically see the statue because it was inside this shrine. It's interesting to note just how distant the Egyptians kind of were from their gods. They never even really physically saw statues of them. Presumably they kind of knew what they looked like from images that they saw carved or painted around, but it's not like in Christianity where every weekend you go to church, you see Jesus, you see a statue of Jesus on the cross or whatever. So we really have a visual representation in Christianity of, at least part of God, or how we perceive him to be in Jesus. The ancient Egyptians really didn't have the opportunity to get this visual as much as we do. And so it kind of reminds me of Islam in the sense that in Islam, they're not really allowed to represent the prophet in imagery at all, Prophet Muhammad. They can't draw pictures of him or anything like that or paint pictures. And I don't know if it's still the case, but they can't even draw human forms. So a lot of their artwork is geometric patterns or words in the Arabic script that are beautified. So it kind of, it's very different, but it sort of reminds me of that, like this sort of unseen God that you don't really necessarily have a strong image of in your mind. But at least during these festivals, they were able to see the sacred bark and they could imagine the God inside there. So it was still a fun time for them. And I think, usually we might think of religious festivals being a little bit somber and solemn, but based on the evidence, I do not think that it was like that at all for these ancient Egyptian festivals. I think it was really like a parade, a party. There was a ton of music and dance, and the priests would be chanting. Some of the priests would be singing. They'd be playing the sistrum. People would probably be cheering, and then the pharaoh was out in front leading this whole, all these shenanigans. So I think it was really quite a visually spectacular affair. And the pharaohs really went all out in spending on these because they were a good display of their power. So I'll actually just read a quote. So we have a stela of Tutankhamun, which talks a little bit about what he did in his reign. And there's a short paragraph about what he did for the gods and these feasts and festivals. And so it goes, His Majesty, life, prosperity, health, hewed their river barks from new pine from the hilltops, the very best of Nagao, worked with the best gold from the hill country so that they lit up the river. His Majesty, life, prosperity, health, appointed male and female servants and female musicians and dancers who had been employees of the royal court. Their work is charged to the palace and the treasury of the Lord of the Two Lands. I am causing them to be exempted and protected for my fathers, all the gods, so that they may be satisfied with the performance of what their spirits desire, so that they will protect the homeland. So you can see from that quote that they took a lot of pride and spent a lot of money and time preparing for these festivities, especially the god's solar bark. And you can tell from that quote that he spent a lot of money because they use like fresh cedar, which wood was not really available in ancient Egypt in the homeland because they didn't really have trees. It was a desert. And so they had to go all the way to sort of modern day Lebanon to get that. That's one aspect of the festival. The second aspect was to demonstrate pharaonic power. Of course, all this spending, all this pomp and circumstance really projected the power of the king to the people. He said, I have all this authority and prestige that I can put on this really lavish affair for all of you. So it projected his power in that way, and he was always kind of at the front of things if he was able to, if it was taking place, where he was located. He'd be at the front of things, leading the procession, indicating that everything that's happening here, I did it. But not only that, there was also a lot of feasts and festivals had a pharaonic component wrapped in. So a ritual component, like the pharaoh would do some sort of ritual to be ritually reborn, ritually rejuvenated, or united with the gods in some way. So what really trumped up the king or the pharaoh as the one who's interceding with the gods and the one who's closest to the gods. So that was another really important aspect of these festivals that we see in many of them. And then the last component, the best component, is fun. I think these were supposed to be a really great time for people to come together as a community and just celebrate and have a good time. There was, of course, all the singing and dancing that I was talking about, but then there was also feasting and drinking. At pretty much every religious festival had some sort of feasting component. And so I just kind of want you to imagine that you're an ancient Egyptian. Maybe you're a farmer who lives near Thebes, or maybe you're a craftsperson who lives in Thebes. Anyway, you know, you're an ancient Egyptian. And so agricultural labor is, let's say it's the Opet festival. So agricultural labor was done from the previous year. So you're kind of relaxing a bit. You're relatively well fed because, you know, the harvest just came in. So you should be okay there. But the food you've been eating is pretty bland, just bread, maybe some beer, maybe lentils, chickpeas, not a lot of salt. So nothing super lavish. You're well fed, but bored with your diet. You're also bored with your work life because agricultural labor gets boring, but then also you're not really doing much right now because it's inundation season. So you're probably super looking forward to this festival, all the good food you're gonna get, all the beer you're gonna get to drink because they distributed all types of beer. You'll get meat for once. You probably don't eat that very often, but they would be slaughtering animals for the feast, and some of that would go to you, the people living around. So you get really great food, and then you get to see this parade. So here's an image of what this might have looked like. Imagine you're one of those people in the crowd, and Amun-Ra is your favorite god, and he's about to come out of his temple for once. You haven't seen him much this year. You probably haven't seen him in a couple of months at least. And so you're really excited because you're a really big fan of this god. You know, maybe you think of him as a protector or something. So he is coming out of the temple, and we got the sistrums going, and you're cheering, yes, Amun-Ra. So I think it would be a little bit something like that, like a big parade, like going to Disneyland and seeing your favorite character, Mickey Mouse, in a parade. You know, it would be really a joyful time, and all your neighbors are around, you're all cheering, you're all having a great time, maybe dancing a little bit, playing a little sistrum. So I think this is how the Egyptians celebrated these festivals, and it was a really great time for them, and the Egyptians loved to party, so it was perfect. So that's sort of, in general, what would happen at these feasts and festivals. And now we'll go and talk about some more specific ones. Okay, so the festivals of Osiris happened in the same season, the third month, I believe, of this inundation season. So we're still in this period of rebirth and regrowth, and, you know, where farming is starting and just everything's starting to really get geared up for the farming season. And this makes a lot of sense because we met Osiris before, and he's really a god that stands for regeneration, rebirth, regrowth, because he died and was resurrected. So he is emblematic of a lot of those processes of, you know, the yearly regeneration and regrowth of plants and things like that. And then, of course, life after death, which we talked about before as well. And so we met Osiris before, so we know kind of a lot about him, but I do just want to remind us that he was a god that died and then was reborn or resurrected in the afterlife. So he gave Egyptians hope for an afterlife. And I want you all to think about how similar this is to Jesus Christ in Christian religions, because I'll be talking about that more later. So not to completely equate them, but there is this similarity here between Osiris for the ancient Egyptians and Jesus Christ for modern and ancient Christians. So he was worshipped all over Egypt. He was probably one of the most important gods, and he was worshipped since probably like the beginning of Egyptian civilization, basically. So it makes sense that he would have a pretty big festival to honor him. And this festival, it happened all over the country, but the main area where this festival happened, or the big deal, was in Abydos. And so here's a picture of Egypt where Abydos is shown. And this was a major cult city. A lot of the old pharaohs were buried here, so it had a lot of religious significance. People actually did pilgrimages too, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. So this feast celebrates Osiris's triumph over death and Seth, as we talked about before in the myth at the beginning of the video today. So similar to other festivals, the main kind of action was a procession of a statue of Osiris inside a sacred shrine, sacred bark shrine, between these 2 points in Abydos, the temple of Osiris. So they would take him out of the temple of Osiris and parade him through the desert, basically along this sort of like valley trail through the desert to the necropolis, which is where he was thought to be buried and where a couple of kings were also buried. And so here's just an image of that. So you can see, this is actually from modern day Google Maps. And I was able to, we don't exactly know where the Temple of Osiris was, but we think it's probably somewhere near, the old city of Abydos. So this thing that I've highlighted in yellow would be the procession. And what happened is along the way, they would do a bunch of different reenactments to reenact different stages of Osiris's death, fight with Seth, and resurrection. So there'd be a bunch of different little plays that would happen throughout this processional, which I think would be really cool to watch. So it was actually, I don't know about you, but this really reminds me of the Stations of the Cross, which is something that Christians celebrate during Lent and Easter time to sort of talk about Jesus's suffering, death, and resurrection, the Passion of the Christ. So this is really the Passion of Osiris. So it's very similar to that. And there's also these little reenactments like you have for the Station of the Cross. So really interesting similarity there. There's a lot of similarities here that were really surprising to me as I was reading about them. And I think they're very fascinating. So anyway, so there would be all these little plays around. And supposedly, the pharaoh should be like out in front, being the one to protect Osiris and getting into duels with all these different demons and stuff as they do this procession. A lot of times he would sort of appoint someone because Abydos was a little bit far from the royal court at most times in history. And so sometimes he would appoint someone. And so we actually have a surviving little stela, like one of these round top stones that was erected that by Ichernofret, who was an official under Senusret III, who was a pharaoh during the Middle Kingdom. So Senusret III had Ichernofret kind of act in his stead during this festival and do all the preparations that would be necessary. So Ichernofret cleaned the god statue, did all the stuff to make sure the god statue was ready. He helped design and build the royal bark to make sure that was all ready to go. And then he was also out there as part of the play. So he was really big, figure in this particular festival at this time. And it's actually surprising the level of minutiae and administrative stuff that this guy Ichernofret had to do in order to have this thing be a success, and he had to personally do. So it doesn't seem like he had a large staff to help him out. He was doing a lot of this stuff. And so I'll read a couple of quotes. This guy, Ichernofret, had put up a stela here in Abydos, talking about the things that he'd done for this festival. So we do have like kind of an eyewitness account, which is pretty cool. So the first thing that he has to do is help with the building of this bark, the sacred bark that they're going to use for the festival that year. And so talking about this, he says, I embellished his great bark, eternal and everlasting. I made for him the carrying shrine that exalts the beauty of foremost of the Westerners in gold, silver, lapis lazuli, bronze, boxwood, and cedar. So this must have been a really neat bark. I mean, it had a lot of different precious things for the Egyptians: gold, bronze, silver, lapis lazuli, and then cedar, like I said, was very expensive because they had to ship it in from Lebanon. So it was a really impressive bark. And I should note that foremost of the Westerners is another name for Osiris, because as I said, Osiris is associated with the land of the dead. And to the Egyptians, everything west of the Nile was considered where the dead lived, the land of the dead, because that's where the desert was. And that was just their association. And then east of the Nile is where humans were. So that's where you're going to find all like the royal palaces and things like that. And then all the cemeteries, necropolises, tombs, those would be on the west side of the desert. So he's called foremost of the Westerners because he's in charge of all the Western lands, aka the lands of the dead. So that's who he's talking about there. So now he's talking about actually during the festival putting the god inside the statue of the god inside the bark. And so he says, I caused him to go inside the great bark. It exalted his beauty. I made the eastern deserts joyful and created rejoicing in the western deserts when they saw the beauty of the Neshmet bark as it landed at Abydos and brought Osiris, foremost of the Westerners, Lord of Abydos, to his palace. So that was him basically getting ready to process the god to his new home on the other side of the desert there. And then lastly, this is him talking about actually during the festival. So he said, I enacted the sailing of the god's bark, with Thoth as steersman. I furnished the boat, risen in truth, is the Lord of Abydos, with a cabin. Wearing his beautiful regalia, Osiris proceeded to the vicinity of Peker. I cleared the god's path to his tomb in front of Peker. And Peker is what they called the destination of the procession, that necropolis area. So he was saying he cleared the path, so that means he was doing some of the fighting, the play fighting, to make sure the path was clear for the god Osiris to go to his little home in the necropolis. So that's Yichud Nofet. And so he wasn't the only one to erect stelas here. Like I said before, Abydos was a huge place of pilgrimage, especially for this festival. So people would come, even when this festival wasn't going on, people would come from all over Egypt, do this pilgrimage, a little bit like the Hajj that Muslims do, to Mecca. This pilgrimage that they do annually, and anyone who has the means should do this at some point in their life. So it was kind of like this for Egyptians. It wasn't required like it kind of is for Muslims, but it was something that every Egyptian wanted to do, which was to do a pilgrimage to Abydos, and then you would erect a stela, one of these round top stones with an inscription on it, to Osiris, talking about how you did this, like, here's me and my family, we came to give Osiris blessings, here's the stela, so that everyone in the future will know, and Osiris will see it as he's being paraded during this passion ceremony that he has. So people came from all over Egypt, and so there were just these rows and rows and rows of stela on either side of the processional way from a bunch of different people. And if you were rich enough, you would put it inside this little kind of small temple house thing made of mud brick. So you would put it inside there, and then you could continue to just keep putting these stela inside here as you went, and your family would have this sort of, almost like a tomb, but it just held all these stelae that you had given to Osiris. So this was pretty cool, and actually the most sacred, or the best spot to have these, was on the sort of the incline going up to the necropolis where supposedly Osiris was buried. So you would find a lot there, especially from wealthy people, because that was the best spot. So this was a really big deal for a lot of Egyptians. It was a high point in their life to be able to go to this festival, or even to be able to go to Abydos generally, not during the festival, and put these stela so that Osiris would see them during the festival. So it's a really unique and interesting festival that I think is super cool, especially when you think about all the connections with the Passion of the Christ and this whole idea of a pilgrimage that Egyptians really wanted to go on. So that is the mysteries of Osiris. All right, so it looks like we'll only have time for that one festival, because I wanted to keep these videos a little bit shorter just to make sure that we're not losing too much attention span. And so actually for the next videos, I'm gonna take a break from ancient Egyptian religion, mostly because I just have a short attention span, and we're gonna move to doing more history-related stuff. So we'll cover the history of a bunch of different regions in the ancient world for like 3,000 years. So we'll talk about Egypt, Babylon, Greece, Assyria, all these different civilizations. And I think what'll be really interesting is we'll talk about them at the same time. So when we talk about what's happening in Egypt, then we'll also talk about what's happening in Babylon at the same time. So I think this will be a really nice way to link histories across different regions and get a much better holistic picture of what was happening in ancient times in all these different areas. So look forward to that. If you liked this video, I'll continue to do more videos on ancient Egyptian religion in the future. But if you want to do more research, I've got a big bibliography at the end of this video or in the comments. If you want to take a look at that, there's a lot more different festivals you can dig into. The ones that I recommend are Tech, the Festival of Drunkenness, which is super interesting. That tells a story of the almost destruction of humanity, but we're saved by beer. And then the Opet Festival was a really big festival that happened in Thebes, and it celebrated the god Amun-Ra and the pharaoh, and that was probably one of the biggest festivals in ancient Egypt. It lasted 27 days towards the end of the New Kingdom, so that's a really big one that you should research as well, and that's in a number of the links that I've provided. So I'll see you next time. Hope you enjoyed.